Elena's scream cut through the smoky air like a knife through butter, and in that moment she realized her father had just done the unthinkable. He had bet her life on a card game. The man across the table, dressed in all black with eyes that could freeze hell over, flipped his final card with fingers that didn't shake, didn't hesitate, and didn't show a single ounce of mercy. Royal flush. Elena's knees buckled as the reality crashed into her chest like a freight train, because she had just become the property of a man they called the Shadow King, and her father wouldn't even look her in the eye. But let's rewind a bit, because you need to understand how Elena Washington ended up in this nightmare in the first place. 24 hours earlier, Elena was doing what she did every single day, working herself half to death. At 6 in the morning, she was flipping pancakes at Rosie's Diner on 5th Street, and by 2 in the afternoon, she was cleaning hotel rooms at the Dallas Grand. Her back ached, her feet screamed for mercy, and her bank account laughed at her pitiful attempts to save money, because every single dollar she earned went straight into her father's hands. Marcus Washington had a problem, and that problem had a name: gambling. The man could bet on anything: poker, dice, horse races, and one time, Elena caught him betting on which pigeon would fly away first from the park bench. She wasn't even joking. "Papa, this is the rent money," Elena said that morning, holding the envelope tight against her chest as Marcus reached for it with those sweaty, desperate hands of his. "Baby girl, I just need a little bit," Marcus said, and his smile was the kind that made her stomach turn because she knew what came next. "I got a sure thing tonight, a real sure thing. I'll double it, triple it even, and we'll finally get out of this dump." Elena looked around their tiny apartment with its peeling wallpaper and the ceiling stain that looked suspiciously like Elvis Presley, and she wanted to laugh, but nothing about this was funny. "You said that last week, Papa, and the week before that, and every week for the past 5 years." Marcus's face did that thing where it crumpled like used tissue paper, and he put his hand over his heart like she had just shot him. "You don't believe in your old man no more?" And that's the thing about Elena, she had the biggest, most foolish heart in all of Dallas, so she handed over the money and watched her father practically skip out the door like a kid on Christmas morning. She should have known better, but hope is a stubborn thing and it dies hard. That night, Elena finished her shift at the hotel and her phone buzzed with a message that made her blood run cold. "Come to the pit, now, emergency." The Pit was an underground poker club that operated out of an abandoned warehouse on the east side, the kind of place where people went in with wallets and came out with broken dreams and occasionally broken bones. Elena pushed through the rusty door and the smell hit her first: cigars, cheap whiskey, and desperation. The room was dark except for the single light hanging over a poker table in the center, and that's when she saw him. Her father was slumped in his chair, his shirt soaked through with sweat, his eyes wild and unfocused. Across from him sat a man who looked like he had been carved out of midnight itself. Damon Cross didn't look like the other players. While they wore wrinkled shirts and had faces red from drinking, he sat perfectly still in an expensive black suit, his face half hidden in shadows, and in his hand he flipped a heavy gold lighter over and over with hypnotic precision. The sound of it clicking was the only noise in the room besides her father's heavy breathing, and Elena felt her skin prickle with fear because this man radiated danger like heat off asphalt in July. "Papa," Elena called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's head snapped up, and for a second she saw relief flash across his face, but then something darker replaced it, something that made Elena want to run. "Baby girl, come here." Elena's feet moved forward even though every instinct screamed at her to turn around and leave. She reached the table and Marcus grabbed her wrist so tight it hurt, and his fingers were trembling and his breath smelled like the bottom of a whiskey barrel. "I need one more hand," Marcus said, but he wasn't talking to Elena, he was talking to the man in black. "Just one more, I can win it all back." Damon's eyes lifted slowly, and Elena found herself staring into the coldest gaze she had ever seen. They were dark brown, almost black, and they assessed her the way someone might assess a piece of furniture they were considering buying. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deep and smooth like expensive bourbon. "What do you have left to bet, Marcus? You've already lost your car, your savings, and the deed to your apartment." Marcus's grip on Elena's wrist tightened, and she felt the words before he said them, felt them forming in the air like a noose tightening around her neck. I bet my daughter." The room went so quiet Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Papa, no," she whispered, trying to pull away, but Marcus held firm, and 2 large men appeared from the shadows, guards, security, whatever they were, and their hands clamped down on her shoulders like iron vices. "You can't be serious," Elena said, her voice rising with panic. "Papa, tell him you're joking, tell him." But Marcus wouldn't look at her, and Damon leaned back in his chair, studying them both with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. "And what exactly are you betting her for?" Damon asked, his tone casual, like they were discussing the weather and not a human being's freedom. "One hand," Marcus said quickly. "If I win, you cancel my debt, all of it, $500,000. If you win," he swallowed hard, "she's yours to do whatever you want with." Hey my people, happy Christmas to you and yours. I hope you're enjoying this story so far because it's about to get even crazier. If you're feeling this episode, do me a huge favor and smash that like button, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to join this storytelling family. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Now let's get back to Elena, because her nightmare was just beginning. Elena's vision blurred with tears as she watched Damon consider the offer. He could say no, he could walk away, he could show some shred of human decency, but instead, he reached for the deck of cards with those long, elegant fingers and began to shuffle. "Deal," Damon said simply. The game lasted exactly 7 minutes, though to Elena it felt like 7 hours. She watched the cards flip, watched her father's face cycle through hope, confidence, and then crumbling horror as Damon laid down his final hand with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've already won before you even sat down. Royal flush. Marcus made a sound like a wounded animal, and Elena felt something inside her chest crack clean in half. Damon stood up slowly, and he was tall, so tall that Elena had to tilt her head back to look at his face, and what she saw there was nothing, no triumph, no cruelty, no satisfaction, just cold, empty calculation. "The debt is paid," Damon said, his voice cutting through Marcus's pathetic sobbing. "She comes with me now." "Papa, please," Elena begged, reaching for her father even as the guards started pulling her toward the door. "Papa, don't let him take me, please." But Marcus had already turned away, counting the few chips Damon had left on the table as a courtesy, his shoulders shaking. And Elena realized with stunning clarity that her father loved money more than he had ever loved her. The last thing she heard before they dragged her out into the night was Marcus's voice, small and broken, saying, "I'm sorry, baby girl, I'm so sorry." The Dallas rain hit Elena's face like tiny bullets as they pulled her toward a black SUV that looked like it cost more than her entire life. She fought, screaming and kicking, but Damon's guards were professionals and they handled her struggling like she weighed nothing at all. Damon walked ahead of them, not even looking back, and he opened the rear door himself with an almost courteous gesture that would have been funny if Elena wasn't absolutely terrified. "Get in," he said quietly. "What are you going to do to me?" Elena's voice cracked, and she hated herself for sounding so weak, but fear had wrapped around her throat like a python. Damon's eyes met hers for just a moment, and something flickered in their depths, something she couldn't quite read. "Get in the car, Elena." They shoved her inside and Damon slid in after her, and as the engine started and they pulled away from the pit, Elena watched through the rain-streaked window as her father disappeared into the shadows, and she wondered if this was the last night of her life. Damon pressed a button and a privacy divider rose between them and the driver, sealing them in silence. Elena pressed herself against the opposite door, making herself as small as possible, her whole body shaking. "Please," she whispered, "whatever you're planning, just make it quick." Damon turned to look at her fully for the first time, and his expression was unreadable, carved from stone. "I'm not going to hurt you." "Then what do you want from me?" He turned away, staring out at the rain-blurred city lights, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "I want you to stop being afraid." But how could she stop being afraid when she had just been sold like livestock? When she was trapped in a car with a man called the Shadow King? When she had no idea if she would live to see tomorrow's sunrise? The SUV drove on through the storm, heading toward the outskirts of Dallas where the mansions sat like fortresses on hills, and Elena closed her eyes and prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening that somehow, someway, she would survive whatever came next. What Elena didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the man sitting across from her in silence had been waiting 15 years for this moment, and nothing about this night had been an accident. The mansion looked like something out of a horror movie, perched on the edge of a cliff like a vulture waiting for something to fall. Elena pressed her face against the cold window of the SUV as they drove up the winding driveway, and she counted exactly 0 lights on in the entire building, which did absolutely nothing to calm her racing heart. The place was massive, all sharp angles and dark windows that seemed to watch her approach, and she couldn't help but think that this was the kind of house where people disappeared and nobody ever asked questions. The car stopped in front of enormous double doors that probably cost more than Elena would make in 10 lifetimes, and Damon stepped out without a word, his black suit somehow not even wrinkled despite the rain. Elena sat frozen in her seat, her mind spinning through every possible terrible scenario, until Damon opened her door himself and stood there waiting with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. "I can't do this," Elena whispered, her hands gripping the leather seat so hard her knuckles turned white. Damon's voice was flat, emotionless. "You don't have a choice." And that was the truth of it, wasn't it? Elena forced her legs to move and stepped out into the rain, which had softened to a drizzle but still managed to soak through her cheap work uniform within seconds. She followed Damon through the front doors and into a foyer so big it echoed, all marble floors and a chandelier hanging overhead that probably cost more than her entire neighborhood. The silence hit her immediately, thick and suffocating like a wool blanket over her face. No music, no television, no sounds of staff moving around or cooking or doing whatever rich people's employees did. Just silence and the click of Damon's expensive shoes on the marble floor. "Where is everyone?" Elena asked, her voice sounding too loud in the emptiness. "There is no everyone," Damon said, stopping at the base of a grand staircase that curved up into darkness. "I don't employ live-in staff. A cleaning service comes twice a week. A chef delivers prepared meals daily. Other than that, it's just us." Just us. Those two words made Elena's stomach drop because that meant no witnesses, no one to hear her scream, no one to help if things went wrong. She wrapped her arms around herself and tried not to let her terror show, even though she was pretty sure she was doing a terrible job of it. Damon turned to face her, and in the dim light of the foyer, his face looked carved from marble, all sharp cheekbones and that strong jaw that probably made other women go weak in the knees but just made Elena want to run for the hills. When he spoke, his voice was cold and precise, like he was reading from a corporate manual. "You have a room in the East Wing. Second floor, third door on the right. You do not leave the house without permission. You do not enter my office under any circumstances. You do not go into the West Wing, that's my private quarters, and you do not speak to me unless I speak to you first. Is that understood?" Elena's mouth went dry. What are you going to do to me?" For just a second, something flickered across Damon's face, something that might have been pain or regret or maybe just indigestion. Elena honestly couldn't tell. But then his expression went blank again, that impenetrable mask sliding back into place. "Nothing," he said simply. "Nothing," Elena repeated, because that made absolutely no sense. "You paid $500,000 for me and you're going to do nothing." Damon's jaw tightened, the only sign that her question had affected him at all. "Your room has everything you need. Stay out of my way." And with that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the empty house until a door slammed somewhere in the distance and Elena was left standing alone in the foyer, dripping rainwater on marble that probably cost more per square foot than her college tuition would have. "Well, this is just fantastic," Elena muttered to herself, because apparently she had been purchased by the world's most confusing billionaire. She climbed the stairs on shaking legs, found the third door on the right, and pushed it open to find a bedroom that made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. It was beautiful, not in a scary, opulent way, but in a comfortable, warm way that confused her even more. The bed was huge with a thick cream-colored comforter that looked like sleeping on a cloud. There were soft rugs on the hardwood floor, and floor-to-ceiling windows showed the cliff edge and the Dallas skyline twinkling in the distance. The attached bathroom had a tub so big Elena could probably do laps in it, and when she opened the closet, she found it fully stocked with clothes. But here's the thing that really threw her. The clothes weren't sexy. They weren't lingerie or tight dresses or any of the things she had expected a man who bought a woman might want. Instead, there were soft sweaters, comfortable jeans, pajamas that looked warm and cozy, and even a thick bathrobe hanging on a hook. Everything was in her exact size, which was somehow more disturbing than if they had been the wrong size, because it meant Damon had been paying attention, had been planning this. Elena sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process what was happening, but her brain felt like it was moving through molasses. She was in a billionaire's mansion, had just been purchased like a used car, and the man who owned her was giving her comfortable pajamas and telling her to stay out of his way. None of it made any sense, and the not knowing was almost worse than if he had just told her outright what horrible fate awaited her. That first night, Elena didn't sleep. She sat with her back against the headboard, watching the door, waiting for Damon to come in and reveal his true intentions. But he never came, and when the sun finally rose over Dallas, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Elena was still sitting there, exhausted and confused and utterly alone. The days that followed fell into a bizarre routine that made Elena feel like she was losing her mind. Every morning she would wake up to find breakfast waiting outside her door on a covered tray. Not fancy rich people food, but actual normal breakfast like scrambled eggs and toast and orange juice. At first she was too scared to eat it, thinking it might be drugged, but by day 3 hunger went out and she discovered that not only was the food not poisoned, it was actually delicious. She would spend her days exploring the parts of the house she was allowed in, which turned out to be most of it except for Damon's office and the West Wing. The house had a library that made Elena's book-loving heart ache with joy, a home gym that she was too intimidated to use, and a kitchen stocked with enough food to feed a small army. And every single day, she would see Damon exactly twice, once in the morning when he would walk past her in the hallway on his way to his office, and once in the evening when he would walk back. And every single time, he would look right through her like she was made of glass. Not at her, through her, like she didn't exist at all. It was driving Elena absolutely insane, and by day 5 she started doing things just to get a reaction. She would stand in the hallway when she knew he was coming, would clear her throat loudly, would even say good morning in a voice that was definitely too loud to be ignored. But Damon would just walk past her with that blank expression, his eyes focused on some point in the distance, and Elena started to wonder if maybe she had actually died in that poker room, and this was some weird version of purgatory designed specifically to drive her crazy. On day 7, Elena decided to test her boundaries because the silence and isolation were worse than any punishment she could imagine. She got dressed in one of the comfortable outfits from the closet, dark jeans, and a soft gray sweater that was probably cashmere and definitely cost more than her monthly rent used to, and she marched downstairs with a mission. She found Damon in the kitchen, of all places, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee and looking at his phone with that same intense focus he seemed to apply to everything. He was wearing black slacks and a black button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and Elena noticed for the first time that he had a scar on his left forearm, thin and white and old. "We need to talk," Elena announced, planting herself directly in his line of sight. Damon's eyes flicked up to her for half a second before returning to his phone. "No, we don't." "Yes, we do," Elena insisted, and she could hear the edge of hysteria creeping into her voice. "You can't just keep me here like some kind of ghost. I need to know what you want from me. I need to know what the plan is. I need to know something, anything, because this silence is driving me out of my mind." Damon set his phone down with deliberate slowness, and when he finally looked at her, really looked at her, Elena almost wished he hadn't. His eyes were so dark and so empty that it was like staring into a void, and his voice when he spoke was cold enough to give her frostbite. "The plan is that you stay here, stay safe, and stay out of my way. That's it. That's all you need to know." "Stay safe?" Elena laughed, and it came out sharp and bitter. "Safe from what? You, because last I checked, you're the one who bought me like I was a piece of furniture." Something flashed in Damon's eyes, anger, maybe, or pain, but it was gone so fast Elena thought she might have imagined it. "I didn't buy you, I acquired a debt, there's a difference." "Oh, well, that makes me feel so much better," Elena shot back, her fear finally giving way to anger because at least anger was something she could hold onto. "What kind of man plays poker for human beings? What kind of sick game is this?" Damon's jaw clenched so hard Elena could see the muscle jumping, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper but somehow more terrifying than if he had shouted. "You want to know what kind of game this is? It's the kind where I'm the only thing standing between you and a father who would have sold you to someone much, much worse. So yes, Elena, you're going to stay here and you're going to follow my rules, because the alternative is so much worse than you can possibly imagine." And then he walked out, leaving his coffee sitting on the counter and Elena standing there with her mouth hanging open, because that was the most he had said to her since they arrived, and it raised about 1,000,000 more questions than it answered. That night, Elena lay in her too comfortable bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Something wasn't adding up, and the more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that there was a bigger story here, something Damon wasn't telling her. Why would a billionaire spend $500,000 just to keep her safe? Why the comfortable clothes and the good food and the complete and total avoidance? Why did he look at her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't paying attention, with an expression that looked almost like grief? Elena made a decision then and there. If Damon wasn't going to give her answers, she would find them herself, and she knew exactly where to start looking. That locked office he had forbidden her from entering was hiding something, and Elena Washington might have been sold like property, but she sure as hell wasn't going to sit around and accept her fate without a fight. Tomorrow, she decided, tomorrow she would find a way into that office and discover what secrets the Shadow King was keeping, even if it meant breaking every single one of his precious rules. Elena's plan to break into Damon's office lasted exactly 3 hours before she decided on something even more reckless. She was going to escape this gilded prison altogether. The decision came to her at 2 in the morning when she was packing her room like a caged animal, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers and a growing sense that if she stayed in this house much longer, she would lose herself completely in the silence and the confusion and the maddening presence of a man who treated her like a ghost. She had spent the entire previous day watching Damon's patterns, and she had noticed something interesting. Every evening at exactly 7 o'clock, he would go into his office and stay there until well past midnight, and during those hours the house was completely silent except for the occasional sound of him moving around. That gave her a window, a chance, and Elena had never been the type to sit around waiting for life to happen to her. The back gate was electronic, which should have been a problem, but Elena had spent 2 years cleaning rooms at the Dallas Grand, and she had learned a lot from the maintenance guy who was always fixing the key card systems. Turned out most electronic locks ran on pretty similar technology, and if you knew where to look and what wires to cross, you could trick them into thinking they were receiving an authorized signal. At 2:15 in the morning, Elena pulled on the darkest clothes she could find in her closet, black jeans, a black sweater, and a jacket that was definitely too expensive for breaking and entering but would have to do. She crept down the stairs in her socks, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Damon would hear it all the way in his office, and she made it to the back door without incident. The night air hit her face like freedom, cold and sharp and smelling like rain, and Elena felt her spirits lift for the first time in over a week. She ran across the manicured lawn toward the back gate, her feet slipping on the wet grass, and when she reached the electronic panel, she pulled out the bobby pin she had modified earlier and got to work. It took her 10 minutes of fumbling in the dark, her fingers shaking from cold and adrenaline, but finally, the lock clicked, and the gate swung open with a sound that seemed way too loud in the quiet night. Elena didn't hesitate. She bolted through that gate and into the woods beyond like her life depended on it, which, for all she knew, it did. The forest was dense and dark, with trees that reached up toward the sky like skeletal fingers, and Elena had to use her phone's flashlight to navigate through the undergrowth. She had a vague plan that involved making it to the main road, flagging down a car, and getting as far away from Dallas as her non-existent money would take her, which admittedly wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than sitting around in that mansion waiting for Damon to finally reveal what he wanted from her. She had been running for maybe 20 minutes when the storm hit. 1 second the sky was just dark and cloudy, and the next, it opened up like someone had torn a hole in the heavens and decided to dump every drop of water in Texas directly on Elena's head. The rain came down so hard she could barely see 3 feet in front of her, and the dirt path she had been following turned into a muddy stream within seconds. Of course, Elena muttered, because apparently the universe had decided she hadn't suffered enough lately. Why would anything go right? She kept moving, but the ground was getting slippery and her phone's battery was dying, and she was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, running into the woods in the middle of the night wasn't her smartest decision. And that's when her foot caught on a root hidden in the mud and she went down hard, sliding down what turned out to be a ravine and landing at the bottom in a heap of muddy, bruised regret. Pain shot through her left ankle like lightning, sharp and bright and absolutely unmistakable. Elena tried to put weight on it and immediately regretted that decision as her leg buckled beneath her. No, she whispered, because a twisted ankle in the middle of nowhere in a rainstorm was basically the worst-case scenario, and she was starting to think that maybe Damon's mansion wasn't the worst place she could be after all. That's when she heard the howling. At first, Elena thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, closer this time, and it was definitely not the wind. It was an animal or multiple animals, and they sounded big and hungry and very interested in the muddy human sitting at the bottom of a ravine. Elena's blood ran cold because she had heard stories about coyotes in the Texas woods, and occasionally people reported seeing wild dogs that had gone feral, and neither of those options were particularly appealing when you were injured and alone. She tried to stand again, using a tree trunk to pull herself up, but her ankle screamed in protest and she fell back down, the mud soaking through her expensive jeans. The howling was getting closer and Elena could see shapes moving between the trees, shadows that could have been her imagination but probably weren't. And for the first time since she had left the mansion, she started to think that maybe she had made a terrible, possibly fatal mistake. And then, like something out of a movie, headlights cut through the darkness. The light was so bright after all the darkness that Elena had to shield her eyes, and she heard a car door slam and then footsteps running toward her, fast and purposeful. A figure appeared at the top of the ravine, silhouetted against the headlights, and Elena's heart sank because she knew that silhouette, knew that tall frame and those broad shoulders and the way he moved with absolute certainty even in the middle of a storm. Damon slid down the muddy slope without any regard for his probably very expensive clothes, and when he reached her, Elena expected anger, expected him to yell at her or threaten her or tell her how stupid she was. But instead, when he saw her sitting there in the mud with her ankle twisted and rain pouring down her face, something broke in his expression, something that looked almost like panic. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, urgent, nothing like the cold, controlled tone he usually used. "My ankle," Elena admitted, and she hated how small her voice sounded. "I can't walk on it." Damon didn't say anything else. He just bent down and scooped her up into his arms like she weighed absolutely nothing, cradling her against his chest as he climbed back up the ravine. Elena wanted to protest, wanted to tell him she could manage on her own, but the truth was she couldn't, and also, being in his arms was surprisingly warm and safe, which was a confusing feeling to have about the man who had bought you in a poker game. He carried her to the SUV and set her gently in the back seat, and that's when Elena noticed his hands were shaking. Actually shaking. Damon, the cold and controlled Shadow King, was trembling as he checked her ankle with careful fingers, his jaw clenched tight and his breathing uneven. "You stupid girl," he whispered, but his voice shook and there was no anger in it, only something that sounded dangerously close to fear. "It's not safe out there. Why do you think I keep the gates locked?" Elena stared at him, really looked at him for the first time, and she saw something in his face that didn't match the cold billionaire persona. She saw genuine terror, like the thought of something happening to her had actually scared him. "Why do you care?" she asked quietly. Damon's hands stilled on her ankle and he looked up at her, and for just a moment his mask slipped completely. His eyes were haunted, filled with something Elena couldn't name, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible over the rain pounding on the roof of the car. "Because I can't lose you again." Again, Elena's breath caught. "What do you mean again?" But just like that, the mask was back and Damon pulled away from her, his expression going cold and blank once more. He climbed into the driver's seat without another word and started the engine, and they drove back to the mansion in heavy silence, with Elena's mind racing and her heart pounding and those three words echoing in her head like a drumbeat. "Can't lose you again, can't lose you again, can't lose you again." When they reached the house, Damon carried her inside and set her on the couch in what appeared to be a living room she hadn't been in before. He disappeared for a moment and came back with a first aid kit, and then he knelt in front of her and carefully removed her muddy shoe and sock. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, as he examined her ankle and wrapped it with practiced efficiency. "It's just a sprain," he said quietly, not looking at her face. "Stay off it for a few days and keep it elevated. I'll bring you ice." Damon, Elena started, but he cut her off. "Don't," his voice was sharp, almost desperate. "Don't ask me questions I can't answer." "Can't or won't?" Elena challenged, because she was done being passive, done accepting the confusion and the silence. Damon stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What do you want from me, Elena? You want me to tell you why I paid $500,000 for you? You want me to explain why I can't stand to be in the same room as you for more than 5 minutes? You want me to admit that keeping you at arm's length is the hardest thing I've ever had to do?" Elena's mouth fell open because that was the most emotion she had heard from him since this whole nightmare began, and suddenly nothing made sense, but somehow everything made sense at the same time. "Then why are you doing it?" she whispered. Damon looked at her with such raw pain in his eyes that it physically hurt to witness. "Because the alternative is worse. Because if I let myself get close to you, if I let myself feel what I've been trying so hard not to feel, I won't be able to protect you the way you need to be protected. Do you understand? I'm not the good guy here, Elena. I'm not your savior. I'm a man who has done terrible things to build an empire, and the only decent thing I've ever done is make sure you're safe." Before Elena could respond, before she could process any of what he had just said, Damon turned and walked away, and this time when the door to his office slammed shut, it sounded final, like he was closing more than just a physical door between them. Elena sat alone in the living room with her throbbing ankle and her racing mind, and she realized that everything she thought she knew about this situation was wrong. Damon wasn't keeping her prisoner, he was keeping her safe. He wasn't ignoring her because he didn't care, he was ignoring her because he cared too much. And somewhere in their shared past, something had happened that had left him broken and desperate and willing to spend a fortune just to make sure she was okay. Elena needed answers, and she needed them now. Tomorrow, injured ankle or not, she was getting into that office and finding out the truth because the mystery of Damon Cross was eating her alive and she was done being kept in the dark. Elena spent the next 2 days pretending to be an obedient patient while secretly plotting her investigation, which was harder than it sounded because Damon had apparently decided that keeping her safe meant checking on her every few hours like she was made of porcelain and might shatter at any moment. He would appear in the doorway of her room with ice packs and pain medication and fresh bandages, wouldn't say more than 5 words, and then disappear like a well-dressed ghost, leaving Elena more confused and frustrated than ever. On the 3rd day, when her ankle had improved from absolutely useless to mostly functional if she didn't think about it too hard, Elena decided it was time to execute her plan. She had been observing Damon's schedule with the dedication of a detective on a stakeout, and she had noticed that every afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, he went for a run on the trails behind the mansion. He was always gone for exactly 45 minutes, which gave her a window of opportunity that she absolutely could not waste. At 3:02, Elena watched from her window as Damon jogged down the driveway in black running gear that probably cost more than a small car, and the moment he disappeared around the bend, she was moving. Her ankle protested as she hurried down the stairs, but she ignored it because some things were more important than pain, and finding out why a billionaire was acting like her personal bodyguard/ghost definitely qualified as important. Damon's office was on the 1st floor, down a hallway that Elena had been specifically forbidden from entering, which naturally made it the most interesting hallway in the entire mansion. The door was made of dark wood and had an electronic lock that was significantly more sophisticated than the gate lock had been, but Elena had been thinking about this problem for 3 days, and she had a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. She had noticed that when Damon came to check on her, he would sometimes take calls on his phone, and during one of those calls, she had watched very carefully as he typed in his security code on his phone screen 6 digits that her brain had automatically memorized because apparently weeks of fear and confusion had turned her into some kind of accidental spy. The question was whether he used the same code for everything, which would be a terrible security practice, but also exactly the kind of thing that busy people did. Elena typed in the 6 digits with shaking fingers, and when the lock clicked open with a soft beep, she actually laughed out loud because apparently, even billionaire crime lords were creatures of habit. She slipped inside and closed the door behind her, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The office was not what she expected. She had been imagining something cold and corporate, all glass and steel and expensive art that meant nothing, but instead it was warm and lived in, with dark wood furniture and shelves lined with books that actually looked red. There was a massive desk by the window overlooking the cliff, and on that desk sat a laptop, several file folders, and a framed photograph that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. She moved closer, limping slightly, and picked up the frame with trembling hands. The photo was old and faded, the corners worn like someone had handled it 1,000 times, and it showed 2 children sitting on the steps of what looked like a rundown apartment building. A girl, maybe 8 years old with braids and a bright smile, had her arm around a boy who was thinner, smaller, with a black eye and a split lip, but a smile that suggested he didn't care about the pain because he had someone who cared about him. Lena stared at that little girl and felt something stir in the back of her mind, some buried memory trying to claw its way to the surface. She knew that building, knew those steps, had sat on them herself a lifetime ago when she lived in the poorest part of Dallas with her mother before she passed away. And that girl in the photo, the one with the braids and the protective arm around the smaller boy, looked familiar in a way that made Elena's chest tight with something she couldn't name. She set the photo down with shaking hands and started searching the office more systematically, pulling open drawers and rifling through files with the desperation of someone who knew they were running out of time. Most of it was business documents that meant nothing to her, contracts and financial statements and legal papers written in language so dense it might as well have been another language. But then she found the locked drawer in the bottom of the desk, and her curiosity went into overdrive. The lock was old-fashioned, the kind that required an actual key, but Elena had learned a few things from her years of making do with nothing, and a bobby pin was just as good as a key if you knew what you were doing and had enough patience. It took her 5 minutes of fumbling and muttering under her breath, but finally the lock clicked, and the drawer slid open to reveal something that made absolutely no sense. It was a scrapbook, the kind with a worn leather cover and pages that had been turned so many times the edges were soft. Elena pulled it out carefully and opened it to the first page, and what she found there made her heart stop completely. Photos, dozens of them, all old, all faded, all showing the same 2 children in different moments. The girl with braids helping the boy with homework at a rickety kitchen table. The boy and girl sharing a sandwich that was probably all they had to eat that day. The girl putting a band-aid on the boy's forehead while he grinned up at her like she had just saved his life. The two of them building something out of junk in what looked like a scrapyard, their faces dirty and happy and completely unaware that life would eventually tear them apart. Elena's hands started shaking so badly she almost dropped the scrapbook, because she knew these photos, knew these moments, had lived them in a part of her memory that she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself they weren't real. The girl in the photos was her, younger and happier and still believing that the world could be kind if you were kind to it first. And the boy, the skinny kid with the black eyes and the split lips and the smile that said he would survive anything as long as he had someone on his side, was Danny, Elena whispered, and the name felt like coming home after being lost for a lifetime. She flipped through the pages faster now, her vision blurring with tears she didn't know she was crying, and she saw their whole story laid out in faded photographs and childish drawings. She saw the day Danny's father had beaten him so badly he couldn't walk, and she had stayed with him all night, telling him stories to keep him awake because she had heard somewhere that you weren't supposed to let people sleep when they were hurt. She saw the afternoon she had stolen food from the corner store for both of them because Danny's father had drunk away all the money again and her mother was too sick to work. She saw the last day, the one she had tried so hard to forget, when the social workers came and took Danny away screaming her name while she cried and promised him she would find him, would come get him, would never forget him. But she had forgotten, hadn't she? Life had gotten hard and her mother had died and her father had spiraled into his gambling addiction. And somewhere along the way, Elena had buried the memory of the skinny boy she used to protect because remembering him hurt too much and survival meant focusing on the present, not the past. Oh my God, Elena breathed because suddenly everything made sense. The poker game, the mansion, the comfortable clothes, the way Damon looked at her sometimes like she was the most precious thing in the world and also something that caused him unbearable pain. He hadn't bought her to own her. He had bought her to save her, the same way she had tried to save him when they were children and the world was cruel and all they had was each other. Elena was so caught up in her revelation that she didn't hear the front door open, didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway, didn't realize she had been caught until Damon's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What are you doing in here?" Elena spun around so fast she nearly fell, and there he was, standing in the doorway in his running clothes, breathing hard like he had sprinted back to the house, his face a mixture of anger and something that looked dangerously close to heartbreak. In her hands she still held the scrapbook, and there was no way to hide it, no way to pretend she hadn't just uncovered the secret he had been so desperately trying to keep from her. "Danny," Elena said, and her voice broke on the name. "You're Danny, you're the boy from the apartments, you're the boy I used to." "Don't!" Damon cut her off sharply, and his voice was raw with an emotion so intense it made the air in the room feel electric. "Don't say it, don't you dare say it." But Elena couldn't stop now, couldn't hold back the flood of memories and feelings that were crashing over her like a tidal wave. "I looked for you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "When they took you away, I tried to find you. I asked everyone, I called the foster care system. I thought you were gone forever. I thought I had lost you." Damon's jaw clenched and his hands curled into fists at his sides, and Elena could see him fighting for control, fighting to keep the walls up that were clearly crumbling. "You did lose me," he said, and his voice was hollow. "The boy you knew, the boy you protected, he died a long time ago. What's left is someone you wouldn't recognize, someone who has done things you couldn't forgive." "Try me," Elena challenged, taking a step toward him despite her injured ankle. "Tell me what happened after they took you away. Tell me how you became this." And something in Damon broke. Elena could see it happen, could see the exact moment when the dam he had built around his emotions finally cracked beyond repair. He moved into the room and closed the door behind him, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with so much pain that Elena felt it in her bones. "They put me in a foster home," Damon began, staring at the floor like he couldn't bear to look at her. "A bad one. The father there, he was worse than my real father ever was. I survived it for 3 years before I ran away, and I ended up on the streets doing things I'm not proud of just to eat, just to live through another day. I stole, I fought, I made deals with people who would have killed me without blinking if I had been stupid enough to cross them." Elena's heart was breaking with every word, but she didn't interrupt, didn't look away, because Danny Damon deserved to have someone actually listen to his story for once in his life. "When I was 16, I met a man who saw something in me, some potential I didn't even know I had. He taught me about business, about money, about power. He was a criminal." Elena, the kind of man who built empires on other people's suffering, but he gave me a chance when no one else would. I learned everything from him, and when he died, I took over his operation and made it legitimate, mostly legitimate. I spent 10 years building wealth and connections and power, and do you know why? Elena shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Damon finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with such desperate longing that it took her breath away. Because I never forgot you. I never forgot the girl who protected me when no one else cared if I lived or died. I spent 10 years becoming powerful enough, wealthy enough, connected enough to find you again and make sure you were okay. And when I finally tracked you down and discovered you were trapped with a father who was gambling away your future, who was on the verge of selling you to people who would have destroyed you, I knew I had to act fast. So you rigged the poker game, Elena said, understanding flooding through her. I rigged the poker game, Damon confirmed, his voice rough. I made sure your father would end up at that table, made sure the stakes would get high enough that he would make that bet, and then I made sure I would win. Because the only way to get you away from him without violence, without legal battles that would have taken months and might have failed, was to beat him at his own game. Elena felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet because everything she thought she knew about the past week was wrong. Why didn't you just tell me? Why did you keep me at arm's length and act like I meant nothing? Damon laughed, but it was a bitter sound without any joy in it. Because I'm not the boy you remember, Elena. I'm not sweet Danny who needed protecting. I'm a man who has eliminated rivals, who has made deals that cost people their livelihoods, who has blood on his hands even if it's not literal. You deserve better than me, and I thought if I could just keep you safe, if I could just make sure you were okay without getting you tangled up in my life, that would be enough. You're an idiot, Elena said, and she actually smiled through her tears because of course this man had spent a decade and a fortune building the resources to save her and then tried to do it without letting her know why. Danny, you were never the one who needed protecting. I was just a scared kid doing what I thought was right. You survived hell and turned yourself into this, and you think you're not good enough. You think I can't see past whatever you've had to do to get here. Before Damon could respond, before he could build his walls back up and push her away again, the security alarm started blaring through the house, loud and insistent and absolutely terrifying. Damon's whole body went rigid, his hand automatically reaching for his phone, and when he looked at the security app, his face went pale. No, he whispered, and there was pure terror in that single word. No, no, no. What is it? Elena demanded. What's wrong? Damon looked at her, and in his eyes, Elena saw fear like she had never seen before. Your father, he's here, and he's not alone. The security alarm was still blaring through the mansion like the soundtrack to Elena's worst nightmare, and Damon was moving before she could even process what was happening, pulling her away from the window with a grip that was firm but not painful. His face transformed into something hard and dangerous that reminded her exactly why people called him the Shadow King. He pulled up the security camera feed on his phone with shaking hands, and Elena pressed close to see the screen, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Marcus Washington was stumbling through the front gate, which was hanging open like someone had forced it, and he wasn't alone. Behind him were three men who looked exactly like the kind of people you would hire if you needed something illegal done and didn't care about the consequences, and Marcus was gesturing wildly toward the house, his face red and sweaty even in the grainy security footage, and Elena could practically smell the desperation and alcohol radiating off him through the screen. How did he get through the gate? Elena whispered, because that gate had serious security and Marcus could barely operate a toaster on a good day. He had help, Damon said through clenched teeth, and his voice was so cold it could have frozen fire. Professional help. Someone gave him the tools and the information to get past my security, which means someone wants to get to you badly enough to invest real resources into it. Elena's stomach dropped because she had known her father was pathetic and selfish and willing to sell her for gambling money, but she hadn't considered that he might be working with someone worse, someone with actual power and connections who wanted her for reasons she didn't even want to think about. What do we do? She asked, proud that her voice only shook a little bit. Damon looked at her, and something in his expression made her think of a wolf preparing to defend its territory, all sharp edges and controlled violence waiting to be unleashed. You stay here, you lock this door behind me, you don't open it for anyone except me, do you understand? Anyone. Where are you going? Elena grabbed his arm, sudden terror flooding through her because the look on his face suggested he was about to do something dangerous and possibly stupid. I'm going to handle this, Damon said simply, and he pulled away from her grip with a gentleness that contradicted the fury in his eyes. I've spent 10 years making sure I would be strong enough to protect you when it mattered, and this is when it matters, Elena. Trust me, please. And because Elena was apparently still that little girl who had believed in a skinny boy named Danny even when the whole world was against him, she nodded and let him go, even though every instinct screamed at her to follow him, to make sure he was safe the way she used to when they were children. Damon slipped out of the office and Elena heard his footsteps echo down the hallway toward the front of the house. And then she did exactly what he had told her not to do. She crept after him, because there was no way in hell she was hiding in an office while Danny faced down her father and whoever else Marcus had brought with him. The front foyer was like a scene from a movie Elena never wanted to be in, all dramatic lighting from the chandelier overhead, and the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Marcus was already inside, apparently. Locks meant nothing when you had crowbars and motivation, and he was packing back and forth like a caged animal, his shirt stained with sweat and his eyes wild with whatever combination of desperation and liquid courage he had consumed before showing up. The three men with him spread out strategically, and Elena recognized the type immediately from her years working in the parts of Dallas where people didn't ask questions. These were professionals, the kind of men who intimidated people for a living, and they moved with the confidence of people who had done this before and knew exactly how much force to use to get what they wanted. Elena pressed herself against the wall at the top of the stairs where she could see but hopefully not be seen, her injured ankle throbbing in protest but her mind too focused on what was happening below to care about the pain. She watched as Damon walked into the foyer, and if Elena hadn't known him, hadn't seen the vulnerable man hiding beneath the surface, she would have been terrified because he radiated danger like radiation off a nuclear reactor. "Marcus," Damon said, and his voice was conversational, almost friendly, which somehow made it more threatening. "Breaking and entering is illegal, and also very stupid, considering whose house you're breaking into." Marcus actually laughed, high and desperate and absolutely unhinged. "You think I'm scared of you? You think you can just take my daughter and there won't be consequences?" He gestured to the men flanking him like they were supposed to be impressive. "I got friends now, important friends. Friends who are willing to pay a lot more than you did for that girl, and they don't take kindly to people stealing their merchandise." Elena felt sick because her father had just referred to her as merchandise, and the casual way he said it suggested this wasn't the first time he had thought of her that way. Damon's jaw clenched so hard Elena could see the muscle jumping from her position at the top of the stairs, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to something dangerous and barely controlled. "Elena is not merchandise, she's not property, she's not for sale." Each word was punctuated like a hammer strike, sharp and final. "And if you or your important friends think you can come into my house and threaten her, you severely miscalculated how far I'm willing to go to keep her safe." One of the men stepped forward, cracking his knuckles in what was probably meant to be an intimidating gesture but just looked theatrical. "Big talk for someone who's outnumbered. Our employer is offering $50,000 for the girl, no questions asked. You can either hand her over peacefully or we take her the hard way and you end up with some broken furniture and maybe a few broken bones." Lena's breath caught because $50,000 meant someone with real money wanted her, and she had no idea why, but she knew it couldn't be for any good reason. She expected Damon to back down, to try to negotiate, to use his wealth and connections to solve this problem the way rich people solve problems. But instead he smiled, and it was the most terrifying smile Elena had ever seen, all teeth and no warmth and the promise of violence barely contained. "You know what's funny?" Damon said, casually rolling up his sleeves like he was preparing to do yard work instead of face down three professional intimidators and a desperate gambling addict. "Everyone assumes that because I wear expensive suits and live in a mansion and conduct business in boardrooms, I must have forgot where I came from. But I survived the streets of Dallas for 3 years doing whatever it took to see another sunrise, and you don't survive that by being soft." And then everything happened very fast. The first man lunged at Damon with confidence born from size and experience, but Damon moved like liquid shadow, sidestepping the attack and using the man's momentum against him to send him crashing into the decorative table by the door. The second man was smarter and came in low, trying to tackle Damon around the waist, but Damon brought his knee up and the man went down gasping for air, and suddenly the professional intimidators didn't look quite so professional anymore. The third man actually managed to land a hit, his fist connecting with Damon's jaw with an impact that made Elena wince, but Damon barely seemed to notice. He grabbed the man's arm, twisted it in a way that looked incredibly painful, and sent him spinning into his colleagues who were trying to get back up. Within 30 seconds, all three men were on the ground groaning, and Damon was standing over them, breathing hard but essentially unharmed. And Marcus was pressed against the wall with his eyes wide and his face pale because he had clearly not expected this outcome. "Hey fam, happy Christmas and compliments of the season. I know this story is getting intense, but trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. If you're loving this series, show some love by hitting that like button, drop a comment letting me know your thoughts so far, and make sure you're subscribed because the conclusion to this story is going to blow your mind. Now let's get back to the action, because Marcus is about to learn a very painful lesson. Damon crossed the foyer in 3 long strides and grabbed Marcus by the collar, slamming him against the wall with enough force to rattle the expensive paintings hanging there. Up close, Elena could see that her father was crying, ugly tears streaming down his face as he babbled incoherently about money and debts and second chances. And she felt absolutely nothing for him except a tired kind of sadness for the man he could have been if he had ever chosen his daughter over his addiction. "Please," Marcus whimpered, and he smelled like cheap whiskey and desperation. "Please, I just need the money. They're going to eliminate me if I don't pay them back. You don't understand what these people are capable of." "I don't care," Damon said flatly, and there was no mercy in his voice, no sympathy, just cold, hard fact. "You sold your daughter, you bet her in a card game like she was a poker chip, and when I won her fair and square by your rules, you had the audacity to come back for more. You don't get to play the victim here, Marcus. You made your choices." "She's my daughter," Marcus screamed, finding some desperate courage in his fear. "My property, I made her, I raised her, and I can sell her to whoever I want. You can't just take what's mine." And that's when Damon snapped. Elena saw it happen, saw the exact moment when his control shattered and the beast he kept carefully contained broke free. He pulled Marcus away from the wall only to slam him back harder, and his voice when he spoke was a roar that shook the chandelier and probably scared wildlife in a 3-mile radius. "She is not property, she is not yours, she is not some object you can gamble away when you run out of money." Each sentence was punctuated by another shake, and Marcus looked like a rag doll in Damon's hands. "She is the only person in this entire world who saw me as human when everyone else saw trash. She is the reason I survived. She is the reason I built this empire. She is everything, and you treated her like she was nothing." Elena's eyes filled with tears because she had never heard anyone defend her with such fierce, absolute conviction, and hearing it from Damon. After all these years of believing she had no value to anyone, it broke something open in her chest and let light flood into places that had been dark for so long. "I didn't buy her to own her," Damon continued, and his voice had dropped to something quieter but somehow more intense. "I bought her to save her from you, from your debts, from a life where she believed she was only worth what someone was willing to pay for her. I spent 10 years building enough power to protect her, and I will eliminate anyone who tries to take her from me. Do you understand? Anyone?" Marcus went limp in Damon's grip, all the fight gone out of him, reduced to the pathetic man he had always been beneath the bravado and the false promises. "You can't just keep her," he whispered. "I'm her father, I have rights." Damon laughed, and it was sharp and bitter. "You lost your rights the moment you put her up as collateral. And in case you're thinking about going to the police or causing more trouble, let me be very clear. I have enough money and connections to make you disappear without anyone asking questions. I have lawyers who could tie you up in legal battles until you're old and gray. And I have enough evidence of your gambling debts, your illegal activities, and your abuse of your daughter to put you away for a very long time." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that Elena barely heard. "Test me, please, give me an excuse." Elena watched as her father crumpled, his face collapsing into tears and snot and regret that came too late to mean anything. Damon released him with disgust, and Marcus slid down the wall to sit on the expensive marble floor, a broken man who had finally hit rock bottom and found it was made of his own terrible choices. "Get out," Damon said coldly, gesturing to the door. "Take your friends and get out of my house. If you ever come near Elena again, if you even think about her, if you so much as breathe in her direction, I will make sure you regret the day you were born. Are we clear?" Marcus nodded frantically, scrambling to his feet and helping his hired muscle limp toward the door like wounded soldiers retreating from a battle they had lost before it even started. They disappeared into the night, and Damon stood in the middle of his destroyed foyer breathing hard, his hands shaking, and Elena realized he was terrified, not of what had just happened, but of what came next. She came down the stairs slowly, her ankle protesting every step, and Damon heard her and turned, and the look on his face was pure anguish. "I told you to stay in the office," he said, but there was no anger in it, just exhaustion and fear. "When have I ever done what I was told?" Elena replied, and she tried to smile, but it came out wobbly because her emotions were all over the place and nothing made sense except that Danny was standing in front of her and he had just fought for her like she was worth fighting for. Damon looked away, his jaw clenched. "You should leave. I'll give you money, resources, whatever you need to start over somewhere far from here, far from me. You deserve better than a man who solves problems with violence. You deserve better than someone with blood on his hands. Elena walked right up to him, ignoring her throbbing ankle, and she reached into her pocket and pulled out the old photograph she had taken from the scrapbook. The one of two dirty children sitting on apartment steps, the girl with her arm around the boy, both of them smiling despite everything. She held it up between them, and Damon stared at it like it was causing him physical pain. "You see this boy," Elena said softly. "This boy who was beaten and starved and thrown away by everyone who was supposed to protect him. He survived. He clawed his way out of hell and built himself into something powerful and strong and capable of protecting the people he loves. And you think that makes him not good enough?" She reached up and touched the small scar on his eyebrow, the same one he had got when his father threw a bottle at him 15 years ago, and Damon's eyes closed like her touch was too much. "Hello, Danny." Damon made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and suddenly the careful control he had maintained for 10 years shattered completely. He pulled Elena into his arms, burying his face in her neck, and she felt his whole body shaking as years of grief and loneliness and desperate love poured out of him in waves. "I thought you forgot me," he whispered against her skin. "I thought I meant nothing to you." Elena held him tighter, her own tears soaking into his shirt. "I could never forget you, I just didn't recognize you without the dirt on your face," she said, and she felt him laugh, actually laugh, and it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. They stood there in the destroyed foyer holding each other like they were the only two people in the world. And for the first time in 15 years, Elena felt complete, like a part of her that had been missing had finally clicked back into place. Damon pulled back just enough to look at her face, and his eyes were red but clear, and his hands came up to cup her face like she was something precious and fragile. "I spent 10 years building an empire just to be strong enough to save you," he said quietly, "but I think maybe you've been saving me all along." Elena smiled through her tears. "We save each other, that's how this works." And then Damon kissed her, soft and gentle and full of 15 years of waiting, and Elena kissed him back and thought that maybe, just maybe, they could finally have the happy ending they had been denied as children. They pulled apart slowly, foreheads pressed together, breathing each other's air, and Elena felt like her heart might actually burst from how full it was. But then Damon's phone buzzed in his pocket, insistent and urgent, and he pulled it out with a frown that quickly turned into something much darker. Elena watched his face drain of color as he read whatever message had just come through, and the joy that had been there seconds ago evaporated like water in the desert. "What is it?" Elena asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "Danny, what's wrong?" Damon looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw fear like she had never seen before. "Marcus's important friends, the ones who wanted to buy you, I just got intel on who they are." His hands were shaking as he showed her the phone screen, and Elena read the name there and felt her blood turn to ice. Victor Castellano. The name was familiar, whispered in the parts of Dallas where people disappeared and questions went unanswered. He ran half the illegal operations in Texas, had connections that reached into government and law enforcement, and he was known for two things: getting what he wanted and eliminating anyone who got in his way. "Why does Victor Castellano want me?" Elena whispered, because she was nobody, just a girl who cleaned hotel rooms and served pancakes, and there was no reason someone that powerful should even know her name. Damon's expression was grim. "I don't know yet, but he doesn't give up, Elena. He doesn't accept failure. Marcus might be gone, but Castellano will send someone else, someone better, someone I might not be able to stop." He pulled her close again, his grip almost painful. "I need you to trust me. I need you to let me protect you. Can you do that?" Before Elena could answer, before she could tell him that she trusted him with everything she was, the lights in the mansion went out. All of them, simultaneously, plunging them into darkness so complete that Elena couldn't see her hand in front of her face. And then, from somewhere in the darkness outside, came the sound of vehicles, multiple vehicles, pulling up the driveway, and Elena knew with bone-deep certainty that Marcus's attack had just been the opening move in a much larger, much more dangerous game. Damon's arms tightened around her. "Stay close to me," he breathed into her ear. "Whatever happens, Elena, I need you to know that I..." But whatever he was about to say was cut off by the sound of the front door exploding inward, and the darkness filled with shouts and footsteps and the promise of violence, and Elena realized that their story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Wow, fam, I know that's a crazy place to stop, but this story is far from finished. If you want to know what happens next, if you want to see how Elena and Damon face down Victor Castellano and whatever twisted reason he has for wanting her, you need to let me know in the comments. Tell me, are you ready for part 2? Drop a like if this story has you hooked, comment where you're watching from and what you think Castellano wants with Elena, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the continuation of this saga. Happy Christmas to all of you, and thank you for being part of this storytelling family. Elena and Damon's journey is just getting started, and trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. Until next time fam, stay blessed.